Hello and welcome to Dialogue. The U.S. has hosted a second summit for democracy after publishing an annual report on the human rights records of countries around the world, except the U.S. itself. What is the relationship between democracy and human rights? How should we re-examine democracies in the West, such as in the US and the UK, as a growing number of people are having doubts or losing faith in the effectiveness of their governments, according to George Galloway, leader of the Workers' Party of Britain and a former member of the UK Parliament. I caught up with Mr. Galloway during his recent trip to Beijing, who also points to the U.S. homeless crisis, swollen prison populations, and a lack of accountability, among other human rights concerns. That's our topic. I'm Xu Qinduo. Welcome to the discussion,
Thank
Mr.
you.
Galloway. You talked about problems, if I may use the word, problems with democracies, especially in Western countries, including in the UK. What made you draw that conclusion?
Well, democracy isn't working. I was almost 30 years in the British Parliament, and there is a lot of ornate, rococo form of democracy, but the content is increasingly devoid of meaning. The proof of the pudding is in the eating, and the British are not eating well, metaphorically and literally. Our country is cold, our people are poorer, their living standards are sharply dropping. The standards of the public realm, public services, the health service, and so on, are all steeply deteriorating at a time when expenditure on war and the language and rhetoric of war is steeply rising. And this is an alarming state of affairs, and one that is mirrored in many other developed northern Western countries. In the United Kingdom, where people are less revolutionary, it takes the form of sullen resentment and withdrawal from interest in politics, from trust in government. I don't know if you took a survey in Britain on national happiness right at this moment, you would find a very low level indeed. Our economy is in a very bad shape. Our international relations are increasingly questionable. We have decoupled from the European Union and made an enemy of Russia and China at exactly the same time. That doesn't leave much. It leaves an Anglo-Saxon bubble of Australia, New Zealand, Canada, the United States, and the United Kingdom, the so-called Five Eyes. But those Five Eyes are increasingly blind, and the people can see it, they can feel it. In the United States, the economy may well go over the cliff. The series of bank collapses and the increasing homelessness and joblessness and poverty. More than half of the people of the United States are now living on low income or poverty. And the trends are all in the negative direction. So if the proof of the pudding is in the eating is not very palatable for most people, the majority of people. Of course, the elites continue to prosper. Indeed, they become richer as others become poorer. It's a zero-sum game for them. But the system of democracy, there was a famous television series written actually based on a book written by a friend of mine, former parliamentary colleague Lord Dobb, called House of Cards. And the situation in Western countries increasingly resembles a house of cards. And one knows what can happen to a house of cards. It can fall down.
Right. But then, democracy is supposed to about, let's say, supposed to be about accountability, or the government or the officials should be held accountable.
Sure.
For example, in the U.S., we do see the homelessness, list is increasing, and then if you look at the number of prisoners in the U.S. in terms of a percentage, it's the highest in the world.
25% of the world's prisoners are in the
Yeah,
United
though the
States.
population is not the biggest, obviously.
It's less than 5%.
Right. How can the government explain to its people, like, well, their priority is about probably Ukraine or the competition with China, with Russia?
Well, that's a very sharp juxtaposition that you draw attention to, and one which is increasingly impactful in the U.S. Political system, in the realm of public opinion. So, for example, a railway a train goes off the tracks in East Palestine, Ohio. It is carrying super dangerous toxic material. It crashes because of the crumbling infrastructure in the United States. And the president goes not to Ohio, but to Kiev to strut his stuff and promise even more military and financial largesse to Ukraine. And until this moment, he still has not visited the site of this disaster, which emitted a cloud of toxic material which has still not dispersed, poisoned the River Ohio, from which 1/3 of the people of the United States draw their water. And I have seen video of the railway tracks, not just in Ohio, but throughout the United States. There's scarcely a bridge in the United States that is not in danger of falling down. There's scarcely a piece of railway track which does not need renovated and replaced. So this question of priorities, the emphasis on war and the preparation for war, interfering in other people's countries, in their political systems, in their economic systems, whilst pretending to be the paragons of, the tribunes of democracy, is increasingly dislocated from reality. And the people can see it. They cannot yet see another way. That would be an exaggeration to pretend that. In the words of Gramsci, the old world is dying, but the new world is struggling to be born. We live in a time of monsters. And increasingly in the Western political system, these monsters take human political form. If you were a member of the public in the United States, and you were told that democracy gives you a choice between Joe Biden and Donald Trump, you would have to say that's a very weak form of democracy. That's a very limited choice. And people look at the leadership in other countries, Xi Jinping, Vladimir Putin, they look at Mr. Lavrov, for example, and they say, well, actually, these are grown-ups, whilst our leaders are not. And I think that more and more people are seeing the shortcomings, the shortfall between the rhetoric of democracy in the West and the reality.
Reality. We'll speak of that. I guess, whatever the system is a country has, or whatever forms of democracy a country has, like in China, they call its practice as, a whole process, people's democracy. It's really about the delivery, whether it delivers. But in China's case, over the past 40 plus years, it developed rapidly, and people in general, if you look at the surveys, they are very happy or satisfactory with their status, with their situations. So probably the outcome or the let's say the results counts a lot in terms of the performance of democracy.
Democracy is not an end in itself. It is a means to an end. Democracy is what the word literally means, the rule of the people, or to use the definition of the greatest President of the United States, Abraham Lincoln. Democracy is government of the people, for the people, by the people. And no one could seriously contend that that is what's happening in Western democracies these days. You know, I've been around in politics a very long time. I was almost 30 years in the British Parliament. I know I've been up close and personal with the powerful. A decisive turn was made 20 years ago, exactly, over the invasion and occupation of Iraq. Something died in the Western democratic spirit at that time, because people, for the first time, I myself had seen it long before, but the vast majority of the people saw for the first time that what we say and what we do are two different things. And systemized lying, as I called it at the time, to the face of Tony Blair, militarized mendacity is your business. You are mobilizing the mass media, you are mobilizing the simple faith of the people in the political system to an immoral end, to a pack of lies, as I told the American Senate. And no one now trusts the governments in the West, even when they're telling the truth. So, for example, in the COVID pandemic, nobody believed them. Nobody believed them because they no longer trusted government.
There's a loss of faith?
There's a loss of faith, of a profound character. And this has, if you like, conflated with a loss of religiosity, the loss of faith in God, loss of faith in leaders, loss of faith in the political system. That's a crisis, you know. It's an existential crisis in the amongst the people. And that is expressed in many ways, some of them very morbid. It's expressed in a turn to racism, to chauvinism, even to fascism.
And Iraq and Iraqi people suffered. You know, we don't see a mature democracy there. As they said, oh, we were planting seed in the Middle East, a seed of democracy. And now, 20 years later, everybody see that, you know, it's an illegal war based on fake evidence, probably intentionally presented by the United States. I mean, to cheat the UN. Of course, they failed, but still, I mean, the war was there.
You're right to point to that as a seminal, pivotal event, both in terms of its impact in the region and on fanaticism, extremism, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and so on, but also in the faith of their own people, in their own system, and in their own government. You used the word probably, but there's no probably about it. I was there. They systematically lied. They knew that they were lying. They knew that they were fooling us. When Powell shook around his little vial, when Blair daily talked about chemical, biological, nuclear weapons, underproduction, can be deployed in 45 minutes. These were systematic lies. And if you don't punish lying in your political leaders, then why should they stop lying?
Nobody was held accountable.
If they can get away with lies, why would you stop lying? But they can't. They haven't got away with it.
As you mentioned several interesting points. You talked about, you know, the loss of faith in government, for example, partly because of the Iraq War, the fake evidence or the lies told, you know, to the American people. I say the same probably to the UK people.
For sure.
You know, that's reminded me of the bombing of Nord Stream pipelines. And according to a famous US journalist, it's the US government who did that. It's a serious issue. Some people would call it like terrorism against critical infrastructure. But the U.S. government has denied that. And then the question is like, if even the U.S. Publicly acknowledges such act, what would the European countries react or respond to that?
Well, we have a situation. Seymour Hersh, the journalist you refer to, is a good friend of mine. I've worked with him for 35 years. I can tell you that although the US government denies it, nobody believes them. Nobody in the US believes them.
Loss of faith.
Nobody in Europe believes them. And certainly nobody in Germany believes them. And what is being exposed in that example is the German government's complicity in this. If the German government was not complicit in it, it would be investigating it, and it would be publishing the results of its investigation. The fact that it is not investigating it and will not publicly comment on Hersh's revelations, and lent on the German media not to do so either, is clear evidence that the United States is guilty of this crime. Now, this is not a small crime. This is the biggest ever act of international terrorism. On 9/11, it was more spectacular because 3,000 people died in front of our eyes, in front of the rolling cameras. But the loss of a 23 billion euro infrastructure caused forever the penury of the European public in energy terms and the absolute dependence on the United States for energy for all time. It has left the European continent shivering through a cold winter with another cold winter only 10 months, 9 months distant. And it has caused the economic collapse. Germany is being deindustrialized in front of our eyes. Its factories are being unbolted from the floor and shipped to the United States. Visas are being given to Germany's skilled engineering workers, green cards, to go and live and work in the United States.
But the European countries are seen as US allies.
More than allies, they are satrapies, they are vassal states of a medieval kind. And look at the king. It's one thing to follow an emperor of note. It's another thing to follow Joe Biden, who doesn't know what day it is, who is lost on a public stage, wandering around, unable to find the exit. To be the vassal of such a king is so utterly humiliating for a civilization as ancient and as accomplished as Europe. Every time I'm on the European mainland, I wonder to myself, how can such a people of such levels of development and culture and language and history, how can they willingly go into such vassalage? And it's, I think, a short-term thing. They will not forever. The French are, as often, showing the way, but others will follow. There are uprisings beginning. They are not yet visible in some countries. They are not, of course, covered by the media in those countries. But a cloud no bigger than a man's hand can be a harbinger of great storms to come. And those clouds are visible, at least to me. The economies, the prevailing culture in European countries is ripe for a rejection of this vassalage. But it might not develop in a positive way. And so China's example. All they ask is the right to their own development without other people interfering and threatening them, threatening them even with war. What is the AUKUS submarine deal and the
US, UK,
sailing
and
of,
Australia?
yes, sailing their warships around the South China Sea? The clue is in the name. What is that but a threat of war? What is the encirclement of China by US military bases but a threat of war?
But China is often seen in the US or presented as the biggest threat to the US. They
Yes,
say
but they never say what the threat is. They never can say that China is sailing its warships off San Francisco. No. They can never say China is building military bases on their borders. Imagine if China and Mexico concluded a military alliance and Chinese weapons began to appear along the Rio Grande. That would be entirely comparable, you know. That is exactly what the US is doing or seeking to do around China. Again, luckily, China has no wish to do that. Imagine if China was encouraging separatists in California or in Mexico and weaponizing them, sending high-ranking Chinese officials to meet with separatists in California or in Texas. Imagine the...
Or sell arms.
Or sell arms. Give arms.
Yeah, give arms to them.
To such people. It's unimaginable that that could happen, and it's unimaginable that the US government would be silent and be quiescent to it. Yet that is exactly what is happening.
Well, of course, there's the concern or worry, or I would call it anxiety in Washington, that with the rise of China, somehow their superiority globally would be replaced or would lose. So even when China brokered this peace agreement between Saudi Arabia and Iran to resume diplomatic relationship, you see people in Washington or Washington itself trying to dismiss these efforts. What do you make of that?
Well, we're now in the period of Ramadan, and it is noteworthy that the Chinese initiative and negotiating skills and concern for the dangers of conflict in the Middle East, in the Muslim world, led to this historic agreement. And it happened here. There used to be a saying, all roads lead to Rome. Well, now all roads lead to Beijing. If you want to solve problems, your road is to Beijing. If you want to make problems, your road is to Washington or London. And this is a very vivid contrast. The impact of this agreement between Saudi Arabia and Iran will not just be felt in Saudi Arabia and Iran. It will, because these two countries are the leaders of two contending schools of thought in the Islamic world, it will transform relations from the Yemen all the way to the Levant, to Syria, to Lebanon, and beyond. So one would have thought that a worldwide round of applause would have issued forth, but it didn't. It was almost ignored in Western media because they couldn't openly regret it that these two foes who by proxy had been creating so many difficulties around the world, they could not openly regret the end of this enmity, so they simply ignored it, pretended that it didn't happen. But nobody in the Muslim world, 1.8 billion people, nobody in the Muslim world ignored it. Everybody in the Muslim world recognized its importance. And if it works, if it holds, we will see very positive results coming from that. I return to my proof of the pudding point. If the pudding is increasingly tasty and plentiful, then everyone has to pay attention.
Related to that, of course, the Chinese peace plan for the Ukraine crisis. And when President Xi Jinping visited Russia, the US side, even before his arrival, warned that a ceasefire is unacceptable. That's hard to comprehend for a lot of people.
It is. Let's contemplate it for a moment. What does that mean? It means you are demanding that the firing continues. The opposite of a ceasefire is continuing fire. So here we had the most powerful country in the world, which claims that it is the other side who launched the aggression, openly setting its face against a cessation of that conflict whilst a diplomatic solution is found. I'm sure that the White House press spokesman was not told to use that word, but he did use it, that a ceasefire would be unacceptable. Well, unacceptable to whom? Not to the Ukrainian people, who have suffered so much in this conflict. They're dying, literally, for a ceasefire.
Every day.
Every day. They are dying, literally, for a ceasefire. So to whom is it unacceptable? The answer is to the beneficiary of the proxy war, the people who launched the proxy war, not on February 25th, 2022, but at least 8 years previously, in the overthrow of the elected government in Kiev in 2014. Although I would argue long before that, they were interfering in Ukraine to use it against Russia, and thereby provoking the conflict that we now see raging to such enormous human suffering and consequence. So China is again proposing peace. America is again preferring war. Eventually, people will realize that. They may not yet have all realized it, and the fog of war propaganda and disinformation is thick. It is difficult, perhaps for you living in China, to see just how thick. But the vast majority of people in Western countries see nothing but that fog. But an increasing number, with the growth of social media, even in the face of the censorship and manipulation of that social media by the state in Western countries, are seeing the truth. They are, if you take my own television program, which is only on the internet, we have literally millions of viewers. Millions. We have more viewers than the mainstream politics programs on British television. In fact, 4 times more than the BBC's flagship political program, Question Time. 4 times more. So people's fingers can wander. They can find the truth if they look for it. They have to look, and they have to look hard sometimes, but they can find it. And increasingly they are and will.
Thank you, Mr. Galloway. Thank you for speaking with us.
It's been a pleasure talking to you. The very best. Good luck.